Hello, folks, and welcome to World War II TV. And this is Leadership Week, and we're talking about some very famous people this week, including later on Patton and Eisenhower tomorrow. But tonight we're talking with two perennial favorites for discussion, Generals or latterly Field Marshals Rommel and Montgomery. And you couldn't get a better person to start that conversation off with than my guest, Peter Caddick-Adams, because he's written about both, not only in a specific book about them, but also they've popped up in various other books he's written and articles and things. So good evening, Peter. How are you doing?
Woody, I'm great. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. We're both an hour ahead of time, certainly in the United Kingdom, and we couldn't have chosen a better time to do this because we've got D-Day week coming up where all these individuals fought, or at least in the French countryside. And, you know, we're slowing off, we're throwing off the sort of months and months of gloom of COVID and all the rest of it because the weather is just being so kind to us.
Lovely today.
This is a great start.
So, Monty and Rommel. So, I mean, we were talking before going live there about you lot watching, and there's a lot of you in the comments there, and Pam and Mary and Simon and Martin Harley, is whether or not an hour's discussion tonight will change anybody's opinions about these two people, because I think they are, of all the people in World War II, they are the people who ideas of how you should think about them are thrust in our faces from movies, from other books. And I think once that opinion settles, it's very difficult to question it. I think if you've studied someone like Courtney Hodges or Miles Dempsey, it's because you've made your own conclusion about that individual. But so often with the big hitters, and Patton I would include in that as well, it's people have told us what to think, or they've suggested a way of thinking about these people. So before we get into that, I want to ask you, Peter, in your years of writing about these individuals, are your opinions, you don't have to say what they are yet, but are your opinions about them pretty much the same now as they've always been, or have you sort of wavered left and right about them over the years?
No, they've completely changed. They changed radically from starting to write the book to when I finished the double biography. And then since, with chatting to an awful lot of people, visiting more of their battlefields, revisiting some places I already knew, learning a lot more, because being a historian, you never stop learning. You have that kind of curious mind. I've revised my opinions of both. And I think that's what writing and being a historian and being a thinker is all about. Because when the book is published, when someone buys your book, whatever it is, what you've done is you've given up writing on that subject. You put your marker like a flag on a golf course by the hole. And that represents your cumulative body of not just knowledge, but thought at that particular moment in time. You don't suddenly flick a switch and then you don't think about it again or revise your views. So yes, I have. They've progressed. I'm really flattered that you've asked me to be the first, because what I hope this whole series of leadership presentations by all our colleagues on all the other different figures is going to give you out there is a chance to knock down some of your preconceived ideas about all these leaders. So most of them are quite well known. And, you know, certainly my two were very easy. They're big hitters, as you say. And therefore we have strong opinions about them. And you've all got strong opinions about all of the others, whether for national reasons or different ideas. But we are looking at this through the lens of leadership rather than national bias or prejudice. We're going to try and get away a bit from the politics, and we want to look at these people objectively in a military context. And you know, that's really important to remember when we look at the Germans, because they, you know, that nationality in either world war comes with a huge kit load that sits uneasily on people's shoulders. So that, you know, this tonight is absolutely brilliant, and I know everyone will have really strong views on, you know, Montgomery, the man who won the Second World War for the Brits, or Rommel, best thing since sliced bread, perfect German general, and hopefully what I can do is show that in both cases it's a lot more nuanced than that. And we mentioned something else just before we began, which is that we live in a very binary world now, black and white. And the politics of the last few years has pushed us in that direction. Stretching that, people have put that into generalship as well. And my view is that all of these individuals, it's not just cut and dried. And there are nuances. They're all black and white. They all have strengths and weaknesses. And everybody's approach to leadership is different. There's no one magic formula. And they all express aspects of leadership. But there we are.
Yeah, and this binary idea, I think, particularly comes in, we'll discuss this later, on Rommel, the idea of whether or not he's a good German. And it's like, to me, there's a lot more shades of grey between being an evil, fanatic Nazi and a guy doing his job. And he's somewhere on that line. But why does it have to be so binary as saying good or bad? Why can't we just say, well, he's in the middle somewhere? He's as most human beings are. And that's what's fascinating about these people, is they have this entrenched idea we have of them, and leadership. You don't have to be likable to be a leader. That's another interesting thing that, you know, is understood, that most people who are dynamic leaders aren't necessarily loved by people. Is that a requirement of being a good leader? I don't know that it is. So that's something I think we can discuss as well. And I also think one of the things, and I'm turning it to my love of football, is I think it's very difficult when you're a leader to change your leadership style halfway through your career. However you set your stall out at the beginning, are you a shouter? Are you an arm around the shoulder type of person? Your followers, the people you're commanding, don't want you to switch halfway through. So I think sometimes some of these leaders, they know they've adopted a style, and they maybe even wish they could change it a bit, but they're stuck now with how they've been perceived at the time. And now we're talking about 70 plus years later. We've now had the peaks and troughs of how we've analyzed them over the years. So we've got the historiography aspect as well to look at. So who do we want to start? Should we talk about, let's talk about Montgomery first, then we move to Rommel. So what do you think are the things are attributed to him that we should challenge?
Well, Montgomery, of course, is of his time. He's his background is largely colonial. He's brought up in his early life in Australia, and he's obviously a product of the English public school. What is key to Montgomery and Rommel, and I think nearly all of your other leaders that you'll be exploring over the coming nights, is that this is the war we associate with them. The Second World War is not their first war. And we touched on the issue of leadership. They learned their leadership in the trenches or wherever of World War One. And today's leaders don't have that. They don't usually have an early war, which they fight in their late teens or their 20s, where they learn how to manage in combat with all the stress and setbacks. And there's a coasting up to grand leadership at some later stage when they've already matured. These guys have been, seeing all best friends, troops that they've commanded, slaughtered in front of their eyes, and they've grown up and matured very, very quickly. And that's certainly the case for Rommel and Montgomery. They both write about their experiences in the interwar period. So by the Second World War, how they're going to lead, that technique is something that's already been self-taught. They're supremely confident, and they've also got survivor's guilt. They are both professionals, and earlier on in the First World War, a lot of their professional friends and colleagues have been killed. So they're both in the business to a certain extent of minimizing casualties and learning, and they've already learned a lot of the errors that people would normally learn much later on in life. So I think we need to take that into account, and that's the same with, of course, all the other individuals you're having a look at as well.
Yeah, and I think that point should resonate particularly with our American viewers, because although, of course, a few of the American leaders in World War II had some experience in the First World War, it was for a shorter length of time towards the end of the war, so they didn't have that evolution of tactics that change from losing it to getting better and winning. So I think that's something to understand where Montgomery and where Rommel earned their view of particularly casualties. I think is something you can't take that away. That's so integral to their stories.
There's a very important point. I mean, Miles Dempsey made this in a letter writing to a historian in the 1960s. And he said, one of the reasons why the Brits were so resilient, say during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, was because they'd suffered exactly the same setback in March 1918 with the German March offensive, the Kaiserschlacht. And they were literally back to the wall. And had the Germans broken through, that would have been it. And there's so many parallels with that winter of 1944-45. And Brits who'd been through it had just seen disaster staring them in the face. And then, of course, Dunkirk all over again. And it's significant that, the individuals we're talking about, certainly on the, the Allied side, a lot of them had experienced that, if they were certainly Brits, had been through that at least, a couple of times in their life before, long before Normandy and the Bulge. And one thing you carry in your back pocket as a professional soldier is that things will go wrong. And we know, I think Slim said, disaster always strikes in the middle of the night when it's raining at the junction of 4 separate map sheets. And it's that writ large. And so this is something that Montgomery and Rommel, separately in their own ways, would have taken away with them, learned and studied and made sense of that during the interwar period. They both wrote pamphlets in Montgomery's case and magazine articles, or infantry attacks in Rommel's case, which sold very well. That brought him to Hitler's attention, and thus started the bandwagon.
I mean, Paul, I'm just checking the comment. Paul Reed says, although Monty largely continued to fight Great War battles and actions like El Alamein and the Reichswald, I'm not sure whether Paul means that as a compliment or negative, or it's just an observation. But I think both of them definitely do show. They show the same types of. They fight battles, broadly speaking, the same way they had done in the First World War. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You've got to call back on what you've done and what you've practiced and what you've had experience of, and they had experience of that, so naturally that's what they're going to fall back on. So I mean that's another point. There's another point about tonight. I mean, for those of you who can interact, please do, because this is part of what Woody's done is we're a small select gathering, and we can certainly interact, and when these when you're able to comment, please do, and we'll field them as much as possible. So Paul Reed says it is an observation. It is particularly about his use of artillery, and I think that is key. Montgomery, to me, is an artillery guy first, whereas Rommel, I would suggest, is maybe an armor guy first. I mean, that's a narrow coat hanger to hang on their skills, but that's how if I had to put a label on them, and I would say Montgomery is an artillery guy. Would you?
Okay, so I can flesh that out. I can flesh that out very easily. They're the products of the wars they fight in 1914, 1918, and both have very different experiences. Rommel, very unusually, is mostly with the Württemberg ski battalion, and they end up in the Vosges Mountains in Romania, and then in 1917 in Italy. So he doesn't have that usual Western Front experience. And the ski battalion of Württemberg, he's a Württemberger himself, they're almost like special forces. And were Rommel to be around today, he would have joined the SAS. I mean, he was superbly fit, and commanding men who had, commanding really strategic corporals, who had a disproportionate influence on the battlefield, as did Rommel. So he was all about lightning advances, mostly on foot, in his case in 1917, turning up where he was least expected, and having a huge degree of autonomy. And you can see how that translates into armored warfare.
Yeah.
Montgomery, his memoirs are presented as being the muddy-booted infantier, who, with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, goes into a platoon attack in 1914 and is very badly wounded, almost killed. He wins a DSO, which is a very high decoration, simply because there isn't anything lower. He's very lucky because he, as he says, in his memoirs, that the week after he won the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross was instituted for exactly the kind of bravery that that he had expressed leading his platoon in 1914. He's close to death and in and out of hospital for quite a long time. Most of the rest of the First World War, he's a staff officer. And when he writes his memoirs, this is when the anti-red tab, sort of Captain Darling and General Melchett, the first iterations of that is expressed publicly in the 50s and 60s. And Montgomery bends over backwards to try and suggest that he's anything but. But in fact, his experience of the First World War is being a staff officer, a brigade chief of staff, a divisional chief of staff, and he's a staff officer on various corps. And in 1917, he's a staff officer at corps level for Passchendaele, the Battle of Ypres. And that's where he is involved in, although he's not an artilleryman, involved in put together the fire plans. And he sees how these things work at high level, long before the attack, when the plans are being written, and then witnessing these attacks going in. And that's how he learns what huge amounts of artillery can do. And our views of Passchendaele are, mud and blood and all the rest of it. I have to push back and say there were some days when some of the attacks at Passchendaele were A, very successful, B, the ground was so hard that shells were seen to bounce off it in 1917. Shells bouncing off the hard-baked clay of Passchendaele is not an image we normally have with the First World War battlefield, certainly not in 1917, but it was the case. I don't want to dwell too much on that war, but it's really Montgomery watching the way set-piece artillery attacks take place in 1970. Then in 1918, when he's a divisional chief of staff, lieutenant colonel, and he can really see how that works at divisional level. And so all of that he will put into practice once he's in a position to call on those assets in the Second World War. So if you look at that, they're both fighting the kind of war that they were taught during 1914, 1918. So Southern Gentleman says Montgomery appears to have organized 8th Army, struggled in Normandy. Did it all go to his head? And was that pushing him too far during Operation Market Garden? The other point I think generally about both of these generals is they're fighting campaigns and battles in response to what their political leaders want largely. Hitler wants swift, quick battles, and Rommel understands that, and he exceeds his instructions to deliver what he knows his boss will like, but also to sort of bring glory back to himself. And to a certain extent, Montgomery is doing the same. Churchill has put his faith in Montgomery. Don't forget, he was second choice. He wasn't first choice as 8th Army commander. Montgomery's got to deliver, but Montgomery's strength is he knows that he can achieve victory if he attacks in his own time. And Churchill is breathing down his neck all the time and saying, attack now. And Montgomery is strong enough of character to push back and say, no, Prime Minister, I'll attack when I'm good and ready. Force of character is hugely important to these people. They're both deeply unpleasant people. Montgomery comes across as, the wonderful guy to the troops. The closer you are to him, the more obnoxious he is. Most of his contemporaries don't like him at all. He's kept in line by his superior, who's the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, and the two are near contemporaries. But even Alan Brooke finds Monty insufferable. Working in his headquarters was apparently quite demanding. I mean, the young staff officers working for him thought the world of him, but they were not a threat. And what Montgomery doesn't like is being eclipsed by anyone else. That's why he doesn't like his mother coming to dinners after the war. There was one famous dinner where he was invited as the guest of honor. The mayor of wherever it was thought it would be a lovely touch to invite Lady Montgomery, his mother, along to dinner. Montgomery was told as he entered the room, and he said, "Well, if she's here, I'm going. I don't care. I'm off." And so they engineered a compromise where she sat on the furthest table and had no interaction with him whatsoever. He didn't like people who threatened his grandeur, his elevation. And to a certain extent, Rommel is the same. The big difference, and I keep stressing this whenever I talk about them, is their training for high command. And Montgomery has been through Staff College, and then he's become an instructor at Staff College, just like all our senior commanders today would be in any army. Rommel hasn't. Rommel has spent his last year of the First World War, which is why he survives it, as a staff officer. He's already risen to get the Paul le Mérite, so he's one of the stars. But he's a junior tactical officer. They put him in a corps headquarters which he loathes and hates, and sits there kicking his heels for the last year of the war. That's why he's alive. But in the interwar period, it's quite clear he does everything he can to avoid going to Staff College, the German Kriegsacademy. And so when the Second World War comes, he has advancement because of his closeness to Hitler, but he doesn't understand how to use staff. He doesn't understand logistics. And that's probably the nub of the real difference between the two.
Yeah. It's interesting when you talked about Montgomery's relationship with his mother, because in the sidebar, there's been several references to whether or not Montgomery is autistic or on the autism spectrum somewhere. And I think that's a sign of the historiography and the modern era we're in, is that where we need to put these labels of he's a mother's boy, he's a so-and-so, and I don't mean just about Montgomery, I mean anyone. It's that, because that wasn't, I don't remember anybody questioning his sexuality or his relation with his mother 20 years ago. That's a very modern thing. In the past, it was all about his leadership at somewhere like Market Garden and Normandy. So that this modern way of trying to understand the personality, what's your feeling about that? Because ultimately we can't prove any of that stuff. It's all subjective. We can't go back, we can't put him in a psychiatrist's couch, we can't, we can only have his own writings and what other people said about him. So how do you feel about that as yourself as a historian, about when people are always doing it? Well, there's this series now about Hitler's sexuality and his sex life, but does that just frustrate you that we're speculating about things that we can't ever resolve?
Well, we are trying to put people into pigeonholes. I think what we have to remember is that anyone who rises to the top has usually got there not because they're a nice person, not because they are, generally good conversationalists, wonderful minglers, blessed with general knowledge, art and culture, and interest in most things. It's because they're single-track minds and they are focused right on getting to the top in their very narrow chosen profession.
Yeah,
I'm sure, by today's standards, Montgomery would fit into, being on the scale somewhere. So would all of your other commanders that we're going to be talking about over the next few nights.
I think so.
Rommel and Montgomery both. And I think, it's a factor of getting to the top. And we can, you can talk about any politicians, throw that into the mix. I do believe that, to get to the top, it's not just luck. It's not just application. It is that single track focus. And Montgomery has often been described as a sort of monk. He was uneasy in women's company. He was married for 10 years and then his wife tragically died. Rommel is pretty much the same. He went in the other direction and actually fathered a child with someone who wasn't his wife. But thereafter remained chaste, and actually his wife really ran the household.
Quite henpecked in a way, wasn't he, Rommel? I was getting that sense that he may have been in charge on the battlefield, but he definitely wasn't in charge within the Rommel household.
Yeah, and I think that would have been the case had Montgomery's wife remained alive, and certainly during that 10 years, he shared a lot of his inhibitions and shyness. Of course, the brick walls all went up again once she had died. I think it goes a long way to explaining a lot of these individuals. Montgomery gets advancement because the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, General Sir Alan Brooke, later Lord Alan Brooke, himself has gone through a similar process. He was driving his wife home from a function at Staff College, overturned the car, and she was killed. Now, there was no suggestion that of any foul play or mistake on his part. It was just a really bad accident. But he identified with Rommel. It's with Montgomery. Brooke could understand exactly what his subordinate and protege was going through because he had gone through it himself. And that's part of the trick of these people, understanding who their contemporaries are, understanding what they've been through, because that's the measure of the individual. To stick Montgomery up there and just sort of say he's autistic because X, Y, you need to look at what the contemporaries are going through at the same time. These are special, unique people. They have stopped doing a lot of the social interaction that we have because they're completely focused on leadership, on battlefield command, on preparing themselves for war. And don't forget, so many of the memoirs that we go through of these people who reach the top talk about an expectation there will be another world war, certainly even in the 1920s. A sense there will be a second round because clearly Germany hasn't been vanquished. Dempsey in the interwar years spent his every leave visiting places in France, the Low Countries, Belgium, Germany, and making notes because he was convinced he'd be fighting there again. And Rommel's the same. Rommel does a whole series of battlefield tours with his wife riding pillion on a motorcycle in the early 1920s. In all the battlefields where he fought. One of the interesting little nuggets I found was that Rommel went back to the Franco-German border, where he'd been wounded in 1914, with Frau Rommel, and it's just quite clearly making sense of what had happened to him earlier in his life, and explaining that to his wife. He was there at the same sort of time as Patton was pottering over the battlefield, and the two were interestingly wounded within about 500 yards of each other, but one in 1914, one in 1918. Near to where Patton was wounded, Harry Truman was in charge of his artillery battery, firing in support really of Patton's tanks. Eisenhower wrote the interwar book of the American battlefield, a guide to the American battlefields of Europe, again published in the late 20s. And this is the same time as Montgomery is revisiting his old battlefields. And I just have visions of them all there in the same week, not really knowing one another. Montgomery in uniform, Rommel not. A young Eisenhower researching his guidebook, Patton stomping around, Truman perhaps. There's the seeds there of a great novel, because people do return to where they fought to try and make sense of it.
A TV sitcom of them all gathered, meeting up in the 1920s. But yeah, I mean, interesting.
But not knowing who each other was, and of course, none knew that the others were destined for stardom. And Patton probably always believed he would be, but that's probably about as far as it goes.
I mean, I'm reading all the comments in the sidebar, and obviously, I'm grateful that we've got a pretty knowledgeable, well-read audience here, which is good. And they are genuinely judging Montgomery the person and Rommel the person. Because do you think, Peter, there's a wider problem with actually when most people, not most, but some people are judging Montgomery or Rommel, they're not actually judging the real guy. They're judging their generation's movie portrayal. Because, I put up a couple of images of how Montgomery has been portrayed. And this is to it. This is Michael Bates playing Monty in Patton.
In Patton, yeah.
And then Bruce Phillips playing him in D-Day Countdown to Victory with Tom Selleck.
Yeah.
And I like Michael Bates was a good actor, but I think there was a real attempt in Patton to make him look just a bit of an idiot, really. And at the same time, we've done similar things with Rommel. We've had the James Mason portrayal of Rommel in two films, The Desert Fox and The Desert Rats. Then, for example, there was Christopher Plummer played him in Night of the Generals, and there was a recent guy called Rick Tucker in the more recent biography. So when people are talking about these people, are they, do you think, someone just talking about a movie representation? Because Patton, I think, is the one for a lot of Americans watching. Patton was a very important movie. It paved the way for lots of sort of 1970s re-examination of the wartime era. So, do you think the movies have had an effect on how we perceive these people?
Totally. I mean, well, Patton is a fascinating movie, and in most people's minds, it's easy to confuse George C. Scott with the real Patton. And of course, what we now know, or we've always known but have never really considered, Patton has a very high, squeaky voice, which doesn't come across, and it sort of detracts. And I think Patton knew that, and one of the reasons why he comes across as overbearing, excessively, irreligious and swearing in his approach and his speeches, is to compensate for his rather stupid voice. And Montgomery is the same. He speaks like this. He can't pronounce his R's properly. And he must have known that he was being parodied by his soldiers. So you compensate. And his approach was to stand on a jeep and get the troops to gather round, which was unthinkable in the earlier campaigns and indeed in the First World War. So they're both pushing against the mold, and I think Rommel in exactly the same way. He's always at the front. He appears unexpectedly just as much to his own troops as he does to the opponent, the opposition, because he's a great rallier of men. His officers hate him because he'll just appear and nudge you or sack you. So they've all got techniques that they've taught themselves that are valuable and bring them closer to their troops. But this is, to often to hide or to overcompensate for a weakness. So what's Rommel's weakness? I would say it's his height. I mean, he's 5'5". He's tiny. Which leads us on to the Battle of Memoirs. So some of you may have read Hans von Luck's book, whatever it is, Panzer Commander. Now, second or third chapter, he talks about being at the infantry school at Dresden, where he's taught by Rommel, and he remembers Rommel being tall and impressive, and everybody had bought and read his book, and he gives the year when he was there. Well, Hans von Luck and Rommel never coincided at the Dresden Infantry School. He got the title of Rommel's book wrong, and it wasn't in publication when Hans von Luck was there. And Rommel wasn't tall. 5'5" isn't tall in anyone's imagination, and you only have to look at him leading troops in parades, and there are plenty of photographs in my book which make the point. So Rommel is overcompensating by distracting people, by always being there, by being close to his men. So all of these individuals are using techniques, which is what leadership is all about. You're doing something unexpected, and often it's to distract from other things. So that's point one. That leaves us with false impressions of who these people were, because we rarely listen to their voices. We rarely see them in context. We just, the pictures we see are close-ups. And then that's translated into Hollywood with a definite agenda. And of course, Montgomery is often made to look a prat. Or, in Band of Brothers, there's one line about Montgomery. He's overrated, says Tom Hanks.
Saving Private Ryan.
Saving Private Ryan. Yeah. And the point about film, this will always happen, because films are all about funding, and you have got to appease your funders by giving the message in the film that your financial backers want. This is why, if you've seen Midway recently, there's a huge clip all about the Chinese fighting the Japanese, and you wonder, what's that got to do with the Battle of Midway? It's only peripheral, because the money, the backing for the film came from China. That's what got it made. So that's the flaw with Hollywood, and so many of us fall into the trap of, as I say, George C. Scott and Patton, almost interchangeable in people's minds. So, we should be worried that, we picture James Mason, or we picture whoever it is playing Montgomery, because they're caricatures. They're not the real person. They could never be the real person, and they're not even trying to be the real person. They're there playing to the actor's strengths or weaknesses, but also nodding to the funders, the backers of that particular movie. So that is a problem. And of course, films can't do nuances very well. They have to do things in black and in very binary terms. And the more shades of grey, the more multicolored you present someone's personality, the more confusing it is for people who go to the cinema. In some ways, we go to the cinema to have our prejudices confirmed, not challenged. Documentaries may challenge it. Historians like me may challenge it. But when we're talking about going to the cinema, that's why people have their prejudices confirmed. In some ways, that's why people go on abroad on holiday. That's why they go on battlefield tours. They don't have their ideas about Normandy challenged or the trenches challenged. They want them confirmed. And they're very upset sometimes if they're not. So this, I realize this is delicate ground, but I think this is what we're doing. This is part of what you've given us by setting up your leadership week.
Well, and this brings us back to where we started, really, about whether it's possible to really be objective about figures such as Montgomery and Rommel. Given we have all this baggage of movies, given we all hear when we, like you said, when I read a Patton speech, I read it in George T. Scott's voice, even though my brain tells me that's not his real voice. That's what the overriding part of my brain manages to convince me it's George T. Scott, and I can't help but think of Michael Bates playing Montgomery and Patton. It all filters through my brain, and that's what we're stuck with, really. But we've talked about you talked about their experiences in the First World War. You talk about both of them. This is where they have a similarity. They're both compensating. Speech impediment, lack of height, whatever it would be. What are their qualities that you say you've changed your opinion of the two gentlemen over the years? What have been the leadership qualities you've always thought they've had, you all admire about? Is there one particular thing either of them have that you think is the first thing you'd put in their bio? He is good at. What would you say about for Rommel and Montgomery?
Well, let's start with Monty, the great British hero who won the Second World War. My maternal grandfather was the same age as him. He was a bishop, and he knew Montgomery because Montgomery's father had been a bishop. And his view very much was that Montgomery was told to go off and win victories, and that's what he did. So how he won them and what kind of personality he had really didn't matter, because his job was to deliver a victory. And so that was one agenda that was set to me, and there was an implicit, don't go messing around too much with that legacy. But of course, Montgomery was his own worst enemy in his memoirs, and certainly after the Second World War. I mean, there's not much about Montgomery to wave flags about or boast about the moment the Second World War is over. He was an appalling chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Slim was much better. And he was then thereafter, being a spokesman on all sorts of things, whether in the House of Lords. But I mean, he was Mr. Rent-a-Quote. And so, where he does bring, he elevates the British cause, he delivers victories, is really in the Second World War. And after that, the reputation he has elevates him onto the international stage. And he's not very good at it. And so he starts to dilute the reputation he created even before that. I'm sure, you'll find that when you look at someone like Eisenhower, it makes him, and he goes on to become a very good, very successful two-term president. But he's operating at a different level. He understands the politics in a way that Montgomery doesn't. So, I changed my view of him. I did become more critical. But that was leavened by the fact that he had been prepared for the Second World War. He was always going to be a prickly character. One of his stepsons sort of said that had Montgomery not married and been married for 10 years before his wife tragically died, he would have probably been so shy, so difficult, so on the spectrum, that he would have not, there's no way he could have been picked to lead a British formation in battle, much less command a whole army. And I think there's something in that. But it goes back to the point I made about characters and how we judge people. The trouble is, when you look at Montgomery or Patton or Simmons or Crerar or Patton or Eisenhower or the Russians, you take their characteristics, their traits, the good ones and the bad ones, completely out of context. People were very, very different in those days. They were far more buttoned up. They didn't wear their heart on their sleeve. No one did. It was a world war, but also generationally, that's how people were. There's a lot of nonsense talked about, Montgomery's imperialist, colonialist views, in the same way that people are slagging Winston Churchill off in the same way for the same reasons. Fine, but that was then. That's how people thought.
Yeah, that's the thing.
We are judging people too much by
population.
We're judging people too much by 21st century values, and in one way, it's right. It's right to sort of, try and think in the way the younger generations do, but it's pointless really, because that generation were never brought up to challenge their own beliefs about the superiority of the empire or their race or ethnicity or anything else. So it doesn't help us in understanding these people if we criticize something for something they weren't even aware of. You can say to a certain extent the same for Rommel, because he's not a Nazi, but he is a fellow traveler. And the problem we have with a lot of Germans is, even long before Nazism became a creed or a belief system, it had adopted some of the pushbacks and resentments that a lot of Germans felt. Being anti-French, being at the receiving end of defeat in the First World War, the stab in the back myth that the German army felt they had been let down by what had happened on the home front. This isn't essentially a Nazi belief. This is just a widely held view of the world and what had happened to Germany in 1914 to 1918. So those are the beliefs that Rommel would have signed up to, and it morphs into something else. But those were the beliefs that Rommel and all his generation signed up to. And if you didn't, you would have been thought of as very, very odd. And of course, the first hurdle that Rommel has to have after the First World War is to get back into the army, because the German army is only going to be 100,000 strong with 8,000 officers. So how do you make sure that you are part of that tiny organization? Now, it's funny, forever we've been taught through every history book a tiny German army, only 100,000 strong. How large is the British army today? It's not even 100,000. So it's relative. It's all very well talking about a tiny army. Actually, we have an even tinier army today. Its capability is completely different. But this is where we're in danger of repeating the tropes. Our army is too small to do anything. Well, that was the German army in 1920, 1921. It's very similar to the Royal Navy is too small today to do anything. We've got 6 destroyers. Well, they're very, very capable. But at Dunkirk, and we're in the week of Dunkirk at the moment, we're at the height of Dunkirk. The Operation Dynamo, the Royal Navy loses 6 destroyers. Well, that's in our entire destroyer fleet of the Royal Navy today. But it doesn't relate. So when we start using 21st century values or numbers or statistics, they mean something different 100 years ago to today, or to that generation. And that's why we've got to look at Rommel and Montgomery in the context of their day, rather than applying today's values. And I think that it's incredibly important.
It's just the last couple of minutes there's been conversations about whether Rommel was an opportunist, which I think he was, but that's maybe sounds a negative way. Or David O'Keefe is saying he was militaristic and would hook his wagon to anything that permitted him to practice his trade. That's exactly the same thing. but using a different bit of language. And I think this is what's so telling about these two individuals, is that you can say the same, you can apply the same statement about them, but your language about them colors whether it sounds positive or negative. I mean, many people are opportunists. That's not negative, but it can be a negative. I mean,
it depends how we define militaristic, but I would say that Montgomery was militaristic in exactly the same way. He presents 1918 as a moment of epiphany when he suddenly decided that that's what he wanted to do. He suddenly decides to be a regular soldier. That's complete and total bollocks, frankly. Montgomery had joined the regular army before the war in 1908. He had gone all the way through the First World War, and by 1918 found he was rather good at it, and there wasn't another profession to go to. I mean, if you're a lieutenant colonel with a DSO, and you decide to leave the regular army, what else? I mean, the world is full of lieutenant colonels with DSOs, and many with higher or more numerous decorations with lots of bars. He's
and
not going to get another job.
And arguably better people skills that transfer into commerce, because
totally. So there's so we've got to be careful with both Rommel's and Montgomery's memoirs. Montgomery presents himself as having his on the road to Damascus sudden realization that he should become a regular officer. There's nothing else for him to do, and he's rather good at it. Nothing's going to dissuade. So I think that decision is a gradual one. It doesn't happen in 1918. It's just self-belief, and it was probably what he was always going to do.
And it's interesting when you talked about Montgomery post World War II as well. What can he do there? There's no role for him anymore. The war's over. You can't carry on. He's not going to go into politics. He'd never do that. So as you said, he became a talking head. He became a renter quote. And he does double down a lot, doesn't he? He could have chosen a path where he was a bit more. Actually, maybe I could have done that a bit better. He could have been a bit more credit to people under his command, spread out the praise a little bit to some of his key officers and his units. But he kind of doubled down a bit, and that frustrates me when I read his memoirs. That he could have been a little bit more gracious, I think, is possibly the word.
You've hit the nail on the head, and I think both our leaders suffer from this. Leadership is all about sharing the glory. You're leading, but other people are following, and you're also growing the generation of leaders behind you. You're helping. And Montgomery's not very good at doing that, and Rommel is even worse because both of them think of this in terms of themselves, and they're not very good at sharing the glory. There are moments when they do, and there's recommendations for medals or an arm around the shoulder. But that's not generally. When the closer you get to them, you realize actually this is a huge ego trip, and the more they get rewarded, the more they become reliant on this public recognition that they get. It doesn't help either. But I mean, if we go back to David O'Keefe's very good point, that Rommel is militaristic and he'll hitch his bandwagon to anything going. So to a certain extent is Montgomery. And the end results aren't so sinister, but we wouldn't have known the direction of travel that Germany was going to go in the 1920s and even the early 1930s. And in a way, that's what pushy future generals do. Those who've got this real self-belief of a field marshal's baton in their backpack, are pushy. And you only have to look at young Winston Churchill. He was known as the really pushy adventurer. And that's why the War Office hated him. I mean, don't forget, Winston Churchill was recommended for a Victoria Cross in 1900 when he was fighting in the Boer War. And one of the reasons why it was turned down was because he was really pushy and aggressive. But in his letters to his mother, he was writing, I've got a bay horse, a white horse, because that will make me stand out and get noticed. And I'm pushing to try and get a decoration. And isn't that the behaviour in a way of Rommel or of Montgomery earlier on in their careers? And the trouble is the bandwagon that Rommel hitches himself to, is an appalling one that delivers all we know about the Third Reich.
And yet he ends up becoming a victim of it, which is part of, I think, how he ends up being perceived as the good German because of the final suicide last visit by the people in the leather coats. And Manfred Rommel, I mean, I'm sure you've met Manfred Rommel. I met him many years ago. You couldn't meet a more loquacious, charming, well-mannered, intelligent guy in your life. And he helped to not revitalize. I think Rommel's reputation was already quite good, but he managed to give a very positive image of his father and was a very sympathetic character. I went to lectures by Manfred Rommel and found him incredibly charismatic. So that affects how we consider Rommel. And we're going to go back to a point just someone made, Jason Russell made. He said about post Operation Goodwood. He said that O'Connor said Goodwood was not one of my best battles. Can't imagine Monty making that statement. And I think that comes a little bit back to what we were saying earlier, Peter, about how they've set their stalls out, haven't they? In that Montgomery has started to play the confident, we're going to do this, we're going to defeat the Germans. If you now make a statement post Goodwood and say, well, it didn't go very well, that could have done him more harm than good at the time.
Well, I think what's interesting is Montgomery's sense of PR is very bad to begin with. O'Connor's already had high command in the Western deserts. Is rehabilitated, escapes from a prisoner of war camp. Churchill is his unfailing backer. So Montgomery, he's proof against Montgomery, and that means O'Connor can say what he likes, even if it annoys his superior, because he knows he's got Churchill behind him. And eventually, don't forget, O'Connor just sort of retires from the Western Front because he's had enough. He doesn't need any more grief in what is, a very vituperative command setup. Actually, the person we should be pointing the finger at for Goodwood is not necessarily Montgomery. It's Miles Dempsey. Miles Dempsey is a great horse racing man, and you only have to look at the operations in Normandy, Epsom, Goodwood. He picks the titles because they are his operations. Now, because Montgomery dives in and wants to be part of the credit when they go wrong, because he's already held a news conference, he's unable to wriggle out, and it's his notes. So I mean, I have a huge admiration for Miles Dempsey, but he just stays silent. He's picked because he's incredibly shy. He's not, the great I am that Montgomery is, and Dempsey is picked because he's the quiet one. Yeah. I mean, the two corps commanders would either be Dempsey or what's his name in Italy, and tennis over the Orne, as he called it. Oh, I mean, the other thing is the language of the day was hunting. Even Montgomery's last minute letter that all the troops get before D-Day is good hunting over in France. And to us, to think of the Germans as foxes is, terribly politically incorrect. But that's just how people saw things in those days. And it was a language that everyone would have understood. Today, you would write a letter or a missive like that in terms of footballing. Yeah. But in those days, it was different.
And that's we talked at the beginning about the reputations both of these figures have. And when I encounter people in Normandy over the years and they start coming at me with a list of things, the list of reasons they hate Montgomery, and they often, what's half the things they're saying are actually criticisms leveled at Dempsey, but they don't know that it's a Dempsey criticism because of what everyone was saying, because Montgomery is at the top of his name is on top of the letterhead, so therefore he gets the blame, just as much as we get with Market Garden, that if people disapprove of the Market Garden plan, which most of us do in some shape or form, you have to also give some of the blame to Eisenhower because he endorsed it. You can't.
Well, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, because one of the very first comments was about Market Garden, and by exactly the same logic, I admire Eisenhower above all others. I mean, he is the man who delivers victory.
Yeah,
because he coordinates all these different egos. But at the end of the day, I mean, he is the one who nods Market Garden through. It's a high risk campaign, and it's written with there's a lot of flaws in it. It's the only campaign operation with two names in the title, Market and Garden. That's because it's two plans welded together, an RAF plan and a 21st Army Group plan, and it's welded together, pretty poorly. It's instituted in haste, in hurry. When the plan was assembled, it was workable, it was doable because the Germans had pretty much broken down. But by the time it's implemented, even just 3 weeks later, the situation on the Western Front has changed so radically that it becomes impossible. And that's, the sanity check, because, the airborne forces are so desperate to get into battle. All the usual sanity checks that we would apply today, certainly, and they usually did in 1944, were thrown away because there was the haste. And don't forget, the airborne forces have been stood down literally on airfields, ready to go on countless missions. So they were agitating like fury for it to take place. But, you have to look at the guy at the top. Truman had that famous notice on his desk, the buck stops here. Yeah. And Eisenhower, I think, felt that very, very keenly. And had Montgomery been quiet, had he not spoken out and said, well, it was 90% successful.
He doubled down. He doubled down.
A lot of the criticism.
Yeah, exactly. If he had there was a crossroads at the end of that battle where he could have said something different about it that would have maybe left us today, 70 plus years on, with a different version. But he doubled down. And it's like, oh no, just, But that's the thing. They know that with Montgomery and Rommel, like Patton, they have chosen to be singular in their leadership. They've chosen to be that it's me, and that is then becomes that's how you're judged. If you want to be a leader, and there's discussions going on about football, the manager of Manchester United going on. You can be a leader where you say you're part of a team, and if you then get success, you have to then give credit to the team. If you set yourself up. Then when it goes wrong, it's all you again. It's you can't have it both ways, can you? You've either got to be
if you set yourself up as the lightning conductor.
Yes.
Then even after you've gone, especially after you've gone, the lightning will still get attracted to your cause.
Yeah.
And that that's what's happened. That's what's happened certainly with Montgomery. There are plenty of other figures, most of the individuals you've chosen actually in your leadership week, and certainly with Rommel. Now, the sway of opinion about Rommel's has gone round and round in circles. Desmond Young, a brigadier, very distinguished, wrote the first biography in 1951, and that immediately becomes the film with Jessica Tandy and James Mason, and that gives us a completely false picture. But actually, it's not willingly false. It's just that was the understanding at the time. So some of your listeners, viewers will be aware there's a big difference between history, which is a narrative, chronological understanding of what happened, and historiography, which is changing interpretations. And they will morph and change almost every decade. Yeah. And they've morphed and changed with both our figures.
So on that subject, where do you think it's impossible to predict this? It's a stupid question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. In 30 years' time, when there's generations who won't have seen The Longest Day, they won't have seen Patton, because I'm finding now there are people who haven't even seen Saving Private Ryan, or because it's 25 years old now. So do you think in 20 years' time, the people writing about World War II then will be able to be a little bit more objective about these figures than perhaps we are now, because we have this baggage of the movies and the comics and the fact we've all met, any one of us of our age, James Holland and all the other guys, Giles Milton, we've all known that old soldier, or many of them, who either hated Montgomery or loved Montgomery. Colin Taylor, my mate in Normandy, his granddad was in the DLI in North Africa. They all had an opinion about that guy. And the problem is for us, we grew up hearing those opinions. And the same thing applies to Patton. Helen Patton's granddaughter is a really good friend of mine. She meets people who say, veterans, they say, I loved your grandfather or I hated him. It's always binary. No one ever says, oh, he was all right. It's absolutely Marmite. They loved him or they hate him. And that is where we're really stuck with Montgomery and Rommel as well. But where do you think we'll be in 30 years' time? Do you think there'll be people being more objective then?
Well, I think books are a huge sway and influence. You only have to look at Nigel Hamilton's 3-volume biography of Montgomery, and yet Hamilton then writes another volume called The Full Monty, which portrays Monty purely in terms of homosexuality. And frankly, it's a load of bollocks, and he wrote it because he needed the money. There was not a hint in the first 3 volumes. No one else has come up with anything similar. And it's fatuous and really rather naughty and certainly very insulting. So that's an example of how books can sway sort of public opinions. Where will we be in 30 years' time? I think people's attention spans have shrunk, and people will rely more and more on videos and documentaries or movies rather than going to the effort of reading the book. And I see that with undergraduates. They want you to play them in academic time a film rather than send them away to read a book or a learned journal article. So if that's the case in 30 years' time, we're running the risk then of people not being aware who Montgomery was, of assuming that Churchill is some kind of nodding dog associated with an insurance company, and Rommel is again someone they'll associate with films rather than books. So what we're doing is, providing a very valuable public service and just sort of pushing back. There are more books available than ever before. We hate the big way that book buying and book selling has changed, I think, detrimentally, but it has actually opened the field up to more authors than ever before. And especially ebooks, which I hate, but as you know, and some of you know, I'm living in Croatia at the moment, so I have to have a Kindle. The books behind me are the only books I've got here. I mean, I have a library of 15,000. I've only carried 100 of them here, but I've now got another 600 on Kindle. So books these days have got to be shorter. Publishers don't like long books, and that brevity will remove some of the nuance and the detail that we're able to wallow in and helps us understand people today. So 30 years time, perhaps we will be going back to black and white.
Maybe
because just time and space and the fact that you see it all the time. Attention spans shrink. You see it with the younger generation. They want everything served up in easy spoon-sized bites. So it's not to say in 30 years' time, our knowledge may not be that much further advanced or that much more sophisticated. And I think you and I are building on, I met Manfred Rommel too. Absolutely charming man. And when I said, what are your overwhelming memoirs of the Second World War, he said, actually, the most interesting general I met was General de Lattre, who was the commander of the First French Army, who had captured him in 1945. And he just said de Lattre's eyes went straight through you. And he was the most disarming, charming individual. But you couldn't lie because you knew straight away he would know. And that is an interesting curveball, because if you say to people there was a First French Army that did very well and fought in 1944 and 1945 that was nearly 500,000 strong by VE Day, they'll look at you, because the only French army that people know in the Second World War is that which was defeated in 1940.
Yeah.
And these sort of things are in danger of being written out of history.
Yeah. So we'll wind things down. We've been fascinating, but give me an example of each of these two figures. Give me an example of something from your own understanding of their wars that we should be judging them on. We're not going to stop judging Montgomery and Market Garden. We're not going to stop judging Rommel on logistics in North Africa. But give me an example from each of them of something for the viewers watching today to go away and study, to maybe formulate a new idea? Is there something in Montgomery's career you can say he should be judged on that he's not? I mean, positively.
Okay, so right. Well, let's start with Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, or Major General Mayor Erwin Rommel, as he was, commanding 7th Panzer Division in 1940. And were you to have a look in my book, it may even be in that PowerPoint presentation, I don't know. At the end of May 1940, he's awarded a Knight's Cross. It's one of the very first Knight's Crosses awarded well, okay, so this is one later on in his career.
Yeah.
In May 1940, he's just been awarded this brand new Knight's Cross, one of the very first awarded to any divisional commander, and the first for the French campaign. And in the picture showing Rommel in front of a swastika flag behind, he's wearing the Paul Mérite, which he won in the First World War, around his neck, and you can see it on this image too, and the Knight's Cross. Now, this is much later on in his career, and there's the Knight's Cross with oak leaves as well, and probably swords for all I know. In the May 1940 picture, having just been awarded the medal, his Paul Mérite is on top of the Iron Cross. So the First World War medal is on top of the brand new Third Reich medal, and the swastika is obscured. And, you know, the message of that is that the First World War is far more important to him than what he's just done in May 1940. That image is much later on, when he's playing the political game, and the First World War medal is covered up. So you can track Rommel's devotion to the regime, if you like, just through a little simple. That's not an accident. You know, the one medal just doesn't fall in front of the other. It's there because it's placed. And it's placed there by Rommel, by no one else. So that's a tiny little image, because good photographs capture a moment, but speak much larger than the actual image itself. And if we come to Montgomery, there are endless things. I mean, at this junction, what we've been talking about, of course, is leadership. And the talk I normally give about both of them is the 10 diseases of leadership, because leadership works both ways. We always think of it in positive terms, and yet there are lots of diseases, and both of these have them. And Montgomery is very much about, you know, his ego running unchecked, and it's usually held in check by Freddie de Gangon, who's his chief of staff. But in December 1944, or in fact January 1945, just at the end of the Battle of the Bulge, there's a press conference, and Montgomery is asked about the Battle of the Bulge and what he thinks about it. And he sort of says, well, it was one of the most interesting battles I think I've ever fought. Well, we did a bit of this, and we did a bit of that. And I had some Americans under command, and we won it. And it was absolutely wonderful. And it just went down so badly with the Americans, because everything he said belittled them. And even Churchill later on in Parliament said we have to be careful in ascribing credit. And the recent Battle of the Bulge, which is the biggest since Gettysburg, had a tiny British proportion, and nearly all of the people involved in fighting it were Americans. And that is a criticism of Montgomery. And Churchill had to go into House of Commons without saying he's got a load of rubbish, he's talking rubbish. There we are. Mary was just talking about the 10 diseases of leadership, and in fact, it's on YouTube. My talk to the Italian NATO command in Italy. So, you know, we've got to look at it in positive and negative terms. So Montgomery's press conference is awful, and if you like, it's one of those moments in time that expresses his ego. And de Gangon is, you know, warns him beforehand, and then has a go at him afterwards. And thereafter, I have to say, Montgomery is very reluctant to talk in public, because he knows that he'll run away motor mouth, in the way that politicians have done in recent times, when there's a press conference and they go up without a script, without a message. And those of us who've done messaging professionally know that really you have to go up with a message in your mind. You're not simply bouncing answers back to journalists and correspondents, you have a message, and the technique that is taught to everyone now is ABC: answer, bridge, communicate. You answer the question. You then go on to exploit that by saying, "Oh, but what we can say," or "This is a good example of," and then you communicate your message. And this would never have occurred to Montgomery, and even had he been taught it, he would have ignored it. I'm not sure Rommel would have been very good at doing that either. But the effective communicator, this is where Eisenhower scores it very highly, because he understands that. And Patton too. I mean, he's very much on message.
We may not always agree with the message, but he's definitely never. It's always pretty obvious what it is he's talking about.
And that's the point. And and we're judging people by the legacy they've left behind, and the legacy is determined partly by those kind of comments or the images that are taken of them. Mark Clark was always very, very jealous about which side his profile was taken, but all his press conferences were fronted with the comment that General Mark Clark's Fifth Army did this. Wasn't the US forces in Italy. And George Patton was exactly the same. Everybody knew Third Army's achievements. It was General Patton's Third Army. And they put out several press releases every day. And that's why they appeared so much more in the US press than First Army or Ninth Army. Unless you're in this paper war and you are trying to dominate, you may think, well, that's not me. That's not the way I'm going to play it. But at the end of the day, we're talking about legacies here, and that's what people will remember. And to a certain extent, this is Eighth Army. And although Montgomery wasn't very good at thinking these things up, he had a very good press and media team. Hence his beret. That wasn't his idea. It was one of his ADCs and the editor of Eighth Army News, and Nigel Hamilton's dad, actually, the biographer's father, who was one of the press gurus in Eighth Army. And they had to come up with an equivalent to push back against Rommel with his cap, his goggles, his tartan scarf, all the little tricks of the trade that gave the leader of the Afrika Korps his image. And so this is how Montgomery arrives at the beret. Before, if you remember, first time round, it was an Australian bush hat covered with badges. Now, Montgomery was also very short. And to have this wide brim bush hat standing on someone who's like a beanstalk and short just made him look ridiculous. And he collected all these badges, and they realized that this was a non-starter. So they then tried to tank Corberry, and of course they might not have stuck with that. But that's the last image before Alamein that's given to the press. And so when the victory, when Alamein is determined a great Allied victory, all the world's media want the picture. This is the one, with that awful floppy berry that we would raise eyebrows at today. But that's the last image everyone had of Monty, and because it's so unusual, so unlike a British general, so informal.
Which comes into this idea. We talked about this early in the show about them setting. Individually they set out to kind of create an image, and then the people around them and then the press add other layers to that as well. So by the end you're trapped by the image you've partially created yourself. The people around you have reinforced, and the public have taken their own level to it as well. So you're trapped in it. Montgomery was, all of these figures, Patton, they were trapped within their own image as well. It's a prison of their own making, I suppose. But you've got to, I mean, I'm come from the printing trade. That's where my background was as a teenager. And I looked into the study of those wartime newspapers and what was capable in terms of imagery. And an image of 2,000 troops standing in North Africa wouldn't have come out with any clarity in newspaper. A single image of a guy wearing a beret, that's the kind of image that we could produce in mass quality with the paper techniques and the printing techniques in World War II. So it had to be individual led rather than army led. That's partly why you get the interview, the articles about Mark Clark's army, Eisenhower's this, Churchill's that, Rommel's that, because you can easily print an image of a single person, and it helps the public understand which direction the country's moving in.
I'd never thought about that in terms of printing and paper quality, that you just can't get the clarity. So it's individuals. I mean, Churchill's look of the hat, the cigar, the watch chain, and the usually the walking cane is not accidental.
Yeah,
and of course the bow tie. It's deliberate. And he's wearing, bow ties are relatively unusual then. And he was wearing, wing collars until quite late on. But it was a brand, and he understood branding, because don't forget, apart from being a politician, and he thought his career was over in the 1930s, he was a world-class writer. And so, part of this is about selling your books. So there's Churchill with his spotted bow tie and his cigar. It's not accidental. And which so is what's come down to us as these charming people from another era. It is deliberate, and it provides the legacy as well.
Which is why leadership is much more than your prowess on a battlefield and your personal qualities in terms of it's about branding, it's about image, it's about how the press uses you, how you use the press, how you talk about yourself, and it's the potential rabbit holes in discussion like this to go down are just enormous, of course. And it does I'm interested in anyone. The sidebar conversations have been rattling along at quite a pace today, but I don't expect we've changed anybody's opinion about these people. We've just maybe given a little bit more to think about how it has come to be that an image has been made about these people by their own making, by us, by movies, and that's it. It's a package of all those things combined that we are left with. And my overriding feeling about both these individuals, Rommel is just an interesting figure to study. That's the little stages of his career are interesting to study. And Montgomery, at the end of the day, as a Normandy guy, and I'm a Normandy guy, he brought the Normandy campaign in under budget, less time than it was intended, fewer casualties than we'd anticipated, and that stands as an accomplishment. Whether he did it the right way, whether he was prickly along the way, is neither here nor there. The Normandy campaign went about as well as anyone could do. And if the other point is if it wasn't Montgomery leading 21st Army Group, who would we have instead? That's when people say he was awful, I say, give me a name of someone else who could have done the job. That's who.
Well, I mean, that's easy, because it could have only been Alexander who had that seniority and that experience of coalition warfare. I think there's an element of luck as well. So Rommel was doubly lucky because he didn't take part in, because it didn't happen, the invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion.
Yeah. Because
he was slated to land in the second wave, and we wouldn't have felt nearly so comfortable about dear old Rommel had he been the invader of Camberley or Chelmsford.
Very good point. Yeah. Yeah.
And secondly, of course, he never fought, and almost uniquely, on the Eastern Front, which had a whole viciousness of its own. And he would have been culpable for all sorts of war crimes on a huge scale that rarely, I won't say didn't occur in North Africa, because there was some rounding up of Jews, but in relatively small quantities. And so, the war crimes accusations were not generally sort of thrown at him after the war to the same extent they were at nearly everybody else. The curious thing is that if we look at them now, Rommel has this super reputation. 1945, he's just another dead German. No, he slid off the front pages a year earlier, and no one knew or cared. And yet, all of a sudden, his reputation completely rebuilt into this sort of heroic status, and now slightly lessened into, a contestable figure. Not detestable, contestable.
Yeah.
Perhaps a victim, but also an opportunist. And Montgomery, who was the greatest living Englishman in 1945, certainly in his own terms, has been sort of slowly ebbing, I think. And the two have completely changed places, which is just a warning shot across the bows that this is what happens with people's reputations.
And will probably, as we said, will probably change again.
And will change again in the future. Absolutely.
They'll be evaluated differently, as we've seen with the US presidents. And look at the Robert E. Lee, how he's go up and down over the last few decades in people's affection and what have you. And so it's I think the next 30-40 years will be if I'm still around, will be the interesting when we look back at these figures from the benefit of post 100 years. But right now there's a lot of baggage with these guys, and that I suppose is just how we have to accept it now. There is lots of baggage with these figures, and I guess our closing thoughts will be to people is to try and read widely, try to use your own logic and brain power to analyze these people. Don't be kind of force-fed someone else's ideas. Try and ignore the movies and try and draw your own conclusions about these, but give them a fair chance, give them a fair, throw away some of your preconceptions and start again, I think, is often the way to do with some of these people.
There's been a lot that's been well written in the last 20 years, I would say, about these pair and all the other commanders that you're going to be looking at in Leadership Week. And I think there's one very good reason for that, and that is we've been at war in the last 20 years. Most of the Western nations have been at war, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan, or we're on operations in Bosnia. And that's a hugely binding, relevant issue, because big war has been front page news.
Yeah.
With various generals, the awarding of medals, setbacks when people are killed. And that gives you a prism that we really haven't had for a long time to look back at the last big war that everyone was aware of, which wasn't Vietnam for the British, it wasn't Korea really, it was the Second World War. And that's why there's been so much that's come up in the last 20 years that's good and objective. And there's a lot of university courses in World War II, Second World War studies around the UK, certainly throughout America and in Canada. And these are great because, people are being harnessed and turning out very, very good articles and books. This is also national agendas. The American view of Montgomery and Rommel has changed a lot, but is driven very much by looking at the campaign through American eyes, through an American lens. The same for the Germans. And we're now, for the first time ever, I think, being ultra critical of our own Winston Churchill through the eyes of, wokeism. Wokeism is a big nonsense because it's nothing new. We've always been critical. It's a name that's been given. We're perhaps a little more extremist at the moment, but this is nothing new, and this is healthy, providing it doesn't get out of hand. I'm not saying pull statutes down, but the debate over people and what makes them tick, what is leadership, is really important for all of us to understand, because leadership isn't just about military leadership, it's about commercial leadership. It's leading in your hospital, it's leading in your school, it's something that affects us all. And you can see the flaws in other people's leadership, but you're a leader. Most people here are a leader in somewhere, maybe in their local church or their youth group or whatever it is. And so if there's, my final comments would be the value of what you're giving us this week in leadership is if there are nuggets that everyone here could take away and say, yeah, that will make me a better leader because I won't fall into that trap, or that's something that individual did and really worked and inspires me and I can do that, then if there's a takeaway, it's not much less looking at the past, it's looking at yourself and saying, gosh, does this improve me? How can I do this? How can I help my colleagues?
And going away from this idea of it being binary as well, in that you could have a bad day of leadership, and if you've got the moral fiber and the strength of character, you can correct those mistakes the next day by how you go back in to your place of work, your youth group, your church, whatever it would be, and say, okay, I screwed up yesterday, shouldn't have done this. Here's how I thought about it overnight. We're going forward this direction, and then you take steps to implement. So it's not that someone is a bad leader or a good leader. They are working at those qualities on a daily basis, and we shouldn't fall into the trap of saying Churchill is good or Churchill is bad. Churchill is a human being like the rest of us. He did a lot of great things for us, and also at times made some pretty poor decisions that are hard to defend. Not just with the benefit of hindsight, they were hard to defend at the time he made them. Some of the things in the 20s,
taking troops away from North Africa to send to Greece and Crete in 1941, when we're on the verge of victory.
It's not binary. Where people are people, and we should give them a fair crack of the whip and analyze their careers over the length of them, and not be forced. We shouldn't be wanting to put a single label to people. That's the danger. Why? That's what you're saying about this attention span. We shouldn't have to always say Rommel in brackets, good German or bad German, or good leader or bad leader. It should be Rommel. Now let's have a discussion about it and give it some thought and some nuance, and the same applies to Montgomery and Patton. But the problem is we're in this world where we need to put that label underneath. We have to say Patton was a big head or Montgomery was whatever,
I think my final comment and observation is as I say, we've seen leadership generally in terms of the positive, and there's clearly a lot of negative aspects that we don't really dwell on, but there are these 10 diseases that you can find my lecture on it on YouTube. And that means at the end of the day, don't expect to like your leader or a leader, because they have unlikable qualities. They have unlikable qualities because that's what's driven them to the top. And that means excluding other people. That means being rather antisocial. They're not great dinner party guests. They're not the kind of people you always necessarily can invite home for tea, because they're single-minded and
we will end, but that comment Mark just made is success often confused with leadership. That's a very good way to end it, isn't it? A leader can do things bad that are bad for me as an individual. He can raise my taxes, he can restrict me in some way, but it might be best for me. And I may hate him for it or her for it, but it might be the best thing to do leadership. And that it's not judging it. It's not personal. If a decision is made on my behalf, the people in the 8th Army maybe not have agreed with everything their leader did, but maybe it was for the best of the country and the army, not for them individually. Anyway, we've gone round in a circle now. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, Peter. We'll leave it there, and it's been an absolutely blinding way to set off this leadership week. Viewing figures have been really, really good today. So I thank everybody for watching. We haven't got to we haven't got to 10% of your questions and comments, because clearly there's a lot to talk about with these individuals. But I value.
Well, I just say, follow me on Twitter if you don't already. And as you well know, those of you who have interacted, I'm very good at sort of answering queries and questions. So, if you've got some lingering thoughts, then please come back to me on social media. But I mean, this has been absolutely brilliant. And what I hope we've also managed to do, the two of us, is set up the sort of kind of questions about what leadership is like, and you can look at the next individuals throughout leadership week and start to judge them in the same way. So don't get too distracted by particular campaigns, and it's very difficult to compare them all with each other. But if you look at things in a more objective way, then that will get you much closer to understanding what leadership is about and applying it to your own lives, because that's the real ultimate goal to me in looking at these people. How does this relate to me? Is there a takeaway I can have?
How can I improve? And also learning the skills of critical thinking, learning how to take on board new ideas, run them through what you already thought, and come up with some fresh ways of looking at things. We all need to do that more often. We all need to step out of our comfort zones, drop our biases, and try and be objective about things and say, okay, I'm going to give this book by someone I don't normally like. I'm going to give it a go because it gets lots of praise by other people. I'm going to have a try and understand what this author is trying to say and give people a chance. Well, there we are. It's been absolutely fantastic, Peter. We will do this again.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Kesselring will be another one to discuss at some point, anyway. But we'll come around to that. But so, folks, tomorrow is Eisenhower. I don't think we have much criticism coming in about John Antal, Colonel John Antal. From the USA is be talking about that tomorrow, so that'll be fascinating. So, folks, don't forget, check out Peter Caddick-Adams on Twitter. Check myself out on Twitter. The book link to Peter's book is in the description below. If you haven't got his book on Monty and Rommel, then what are you waiting for? Go and get it. It's interesting. And we'll see you all tomorrow, same time for Eisenhower. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Cheers. Good night, everybody.